Alrighty. Can y'all hear me? Okay, there's the share screen button. There's the mute. Okay. Sorry, folks. I've never done a live stream before, so I'm still learning all of the little tools here on YouTube. Alrighty. Awesome. So it looks like we already got a couple people here. Let's keep the comments safe for work, please. Thank you. All right. So welcome everybody to the first ever Fleets AP Art History YouTube live stream. I'm super happy to have you all here today. What I'm going to be doing today is going through a series of slides with some prepared questions from students. And then I'm going to be going through a couple of practice problems with y'all. And then when we get to the end of that, then I will open up the floor for questions or anything else that students want to do for the live stream. Sound good? All right. I also want to thank everybody for the really nice messages that I've been receiving over the last couple of days. It's always very nice and affirming to have students say nice things about me. I feel like my own students don't really appreciate me as much. So thank you. Alrighty. So let's see here. Alrighty, so let me share screen. Gosh, I am getting flashbacks to remote teaching during COVID. I don't know about y'all. Alrighty. So here's my super fun Google Slides presentation. I'm not entirely sure how long this is going to be. We'll see how long it takes. Okay. So here we go. So this was a list of things that students asked me about on the YouTube channel, like in the comment sections and so on. I was asked about like a key timeline of the AP curriculum, attributing artworks to an artist time period and or region. So basically the stuff that's covered in FRQ number 5. Also important architecture terms and features. There was also a question about how to study for MCQs. And then there are also the 6 FRQs, those 6 essay questions, and basically how to respond to them. So again, after I answer these questions, I'll be available to answer other questions live. The more specific the question, the better. Okay? Alrighty. So in terms of creating a key timeline of the AP curriculum, I would say that this is definitely something that is easier said than done. There are some parts of the AP curriculum that are pretty straightforward, especially when we are looking at the ancient world. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that like we just have limited information about the ancient world. Whereas as we get close to the present, we have more and more information. So it tends to be a little bit more overwhelming, right? So like for ancient Greece, we have archaic, and then after archaic is classical, and then after classical is Hellenistic. It's very nice. And one is kind of after the other. There's not really a ton of overlap, right? But there's others like 20th and 21st century that are more like this. And it's like, right? There's lots of things that are happening simultaneously, and it tends to be a little bit more confusing and overwhelming. Okay. So I would say that in terms of understanding chronology, basically the way that things are going in terms of like order from like start to finish, that there are a couple of units that I would really prioritize in terms of understanding like what comes first and then what comes later. I would say that units 1, 2, 3, and 4, this is pretty important. And thankfully, the way that I teach this class pretty much covers each unit chronologically. Like for example, with the ancient Mediterranean unit, I start with ancient Mesopotamia, and we start with like the White Temple in Ziggurat, which is the oldest. And then we end with the Abaddon and Audience Hall of Persepolis, right? Which is quite a bit later, right? So, like within Mesopotamia, we have like earliest to latest. Within Egypt, we have Old Kingdom to New Kingdom, right? So, the way that the curriculum is covered should go in pretty much chronological order for all of these. So, I would say that like understanding chronology to the extent like understanding which sort of like movements or cultures or civilizations are coming before others is going to be important. So, for example, remembering that like Byzantine is coming before Baroque, right? Alrighty. So I would say that in terms of like mid priority for understanding chronology, units 5, 7, and 8 are in this category. For the Indigenous Americas, I would focus more on being able to distinguish artwork by culture. So, for example, being able to look at an artwork or a work of architecture and being like, yeah, that's Aztec, or yes, that's Chavin, or it's Inca, right? For West and Central Asia, this unit focuses primarily on cross cultural influence, which makes sense because it is at the meeting place of Europe and Asia. Right. So being able to connect instances of contact between cultures to evidence of cross cultural interaction in works of art is going to be important. So, for example, in Persian manuscripts in the Shahnameh, like the Court of Kayumars or Bahram Gurfight's The Karg, it's important to remember that these Mongol invasions into Persia, so the Mongols going from the east into the west in the 1200s, is going to result in a lot of influence from East Asia making its way into Central Asia, what is now Iran, right? So for Unit 8, again, I would focus on instances of cross cultural interaction and think a little bit more broadly about what these influences are in terms of religion, right? So think about like when do Buddhism and Hinduism reach different parts of Asia and begin to influence art and design. Think about, for example, when Buddhism is influencing different parts of China, right? So, like with the funeral banner of Lady Di, right? We're not going to really see any Buddhist influence in that artwork because it's before Buddhism reaches China, right? But if you go to Longmen Caves, we have this gigantic colossal Buddha, right? So this is what I mean by chronology, understanding, okay, like Buddhism reached China at this point, so we are going to begin seeing Buddhist influence in artwork at this point. Right. And again, I wouldn't necessarily say that like a particular date is something that you necessarily need to remember, but just understanding like first it was this and then it was that. Right. So again, try with when it comes to understanding each of these units, I would focus less about like being bogged down by little details like remembering discrete numbers, like when it comes to dates and so on, and think about like the forest rather than the individual trees, right? How are these things connecting together, right? In terms of units where chronology is not necessarily going to be as important, I would say that our Africa Pacific Islands and global contemporary curriculum or curricula are going to be fitting into this category. So with Africa and the Pacific Islands, I would focus on being able to distinguish these artworks by culture. We're going to be focusing a little bit more on that when we look at some examples of attribution essays. And when it comes to the global contemporary curriculum, like the global contemporary curriculum is a little bit different from the other units within AP Art History, in that understanding these artworks really requires us to look back at the previous 9 units. Right. So being able to connect the visual and cultural influences represented in each of these artworks, I think is going to be the most important. So, for example, being able to say, okay, Song Sunem's Summer Trees, the inkwash painting, right, was influenced in both its media, India ink, and subject matter, trees, nature, by East Asian inkwash paintings like Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, that piece by Fan Quan, the hanging scroll from around 1000 CE, right? All right. So, were there any regarding timelines? Doesn't look like it. Alrighty. All right. Second order ends. Um, the fact of the matter is that some of these are actually like some of them, like depending on the year, tend to be like easier, and then others tend to be more difficult, right? So we're looking at this example right here on the slides right now, right? So what is the artwork that is in our AP curriculum that is most similar to this one? Any guesses? Thank you. Yes, the Colosseum or the Flavian Amphitheater, right? Which is 72 to 80 CE, if I remember correctly. It was built in 8 years. I actually went to the Colosseum back in April. It's a colonnade, right? And we have the pilasters, these kind of fake columns, right? And then when we look on the inside, we are seeing an example of an amphitheater, right? Where we have this kind of circular pit in the middle, right? And then we have the seating that is radiating out on all sides. So it's this panoramic seating. Very, very similar to the Roman Colosseum. Okay. Be able to attribute this artwork to the specific African culture that created it. Yes. Yes, this was created by the ballet people. Excellent. It's called an embleau or portrait mask, right? Now, a couple of things that you might recognize with regard to this mask are these sort of horn-like projections that are coming out of the top of the head. This is meant to reference a hairstyle. There's also aspects of the face. For example, the very long, thin nose, the heavily arched brows, and the closed mouth that we saw in the portrait mask from the AP curriculum, right? I'm sorry that the stream is lagging for y'all. I don't really know how to fix that on my end. The good news is that this will be posted as a video after the live stream. So if you want to tune in after that, that's totally fine. Okay. Alrighty. This one's a little bit trickier. I know that students tend to struggle with architecture. So what is the artwork in the AP curriculum that is the to this one? Yes, the Villa Savoy by Le Corbusier. Again, I apologize for my horrible pronunciation. Excellent. So a couple of things that we might identify as being similar to that artwork curriculum are these tall, thin columns that are supporting the main body of the architecture, right? We also have these ribbon windows, right? And then we also have this very modular design, this very geometric modular design. I like to say that the international style looks a lot like IKEA furniture. Also just like mostly monochromatic. Alrighty. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about architecture in just a moment, I promise. I'm like trying to keep up with the chat and the screen at the same time. I apologize. Y'all are not done for. You're going to be fine. My goodness. So much negativity in the chat today. All right. What about this artwork? So I would attribute this to a specific artist. The horn players guy? Yes, Jean-Michel Basquiat, right? So Basquiat created that triptych, right? And it had Charlie the Bird Parker and Dizzy Gillespie on it, those two jazz players, right? And one of the things that you frequently see in Basquiat's work is these layering of elements in a manner that's very similar to abstract expressionism. He also frequently uses these linear elements, right? Where he's drawing and superimposing these things on top of each other, typically on these fields of color, right? And then we're also seeing these collections of different words and phrases that don't really necessarily see unity within these words. So, interesting thing about Basquiat, oftentimes in his studio, like he would have like the TV or the radio going, or he'd have like textbooks open, like in his studio, and he would sometimes be working on multiple paintings at once. And he would essentially be like working on a painting, and then like things that were like said on the radio or that he saw in textbooks, he would write or draw onto his canvases. Super interesting, weird guy. I do not have any FRQ predictions. I can't help you there. Sorry. There's 250 artworks, and some artists they've asked about more than once on FRQs. Like I noticed that they asked about Faith Ringgold on the last exam, and then they also asked about her a couple years ago. So I used to think that they would not ask about an artist or an artwork more than once in the FRQ, but that is clearly not the case. The best way to like address prediction rumors is to just buckle down and actually study the artworks, right? It's not really worth your time to like speculate or like come up with some sort of conspiracy theory as to what the FRQ artworks are going to be. That's not going to help you. I can almost guarantee though that they probably won't have Faith Ringgold again. In terms of identifiers, it really depends on the essay question. I'm seeing this question coming up in the chat a lot. So there are certain FRQ number 5s that will ask for like the specific artist or the specific culture of origin. I know that with the portrait mask right here, they asked for the specific culture of origin. And then you had to provide at least one other accurate identifier. So accurate identifiers include the title or the designation, the artist, or in some cases, the culture of origin, the materials, and the date of creation. Okay, so if you said portrait mask created by the ballet people, that would get 2 out of 2 identifier points. Okay. Sometimes it asks you for one of them, and then you have the choice to provide any of the 3 others. Okay. Do art movements count as identifiers? I would say that if they're asking for a specific artist and you only talk about the artist movement, then probably not. All right. So what about this artwork? What artwork is this most similar to? Yes, the Quackyoodle or Quack Waka Waka transformation mask, right? In the closed position, it's a bird, and then when it opens up, you see a human face inside. So this mask is a combination of anthropomorphic and zoomorphic elements, right? Anthropomorphic is a fancy word that means human shaped or resembling a human, and zoomorphic is a fancy word that means resembling an animal or animal shaped. No, they will not dock off points if you can't spell Quack Waka Waka correctly or Quackydoodle correctly, right? Typically, as long as like, and I get this question a lot from students. Like, if I spell it incorrectly, Mixed Fleet, like, will I not get the points? It depends. If you were to attribute this mask to the Quokka people, right, and not like the Quackydoodle, right? As long as like Quokka isn't like going to be reasonably confused with anything else in the curriculum, that's fine. If you were to call it, for example, like bird portrait mask, that's not correct, right? All right. So I wanted to go through a specific example with y'all. This is the FRQ number 5 from the 2022 AP exam. Okay. So question A says correctly attribute the work shown to the specific culture from the indigenous Americas in which it was created. So we already established that that was the Quackydoodle. or quack, waka, waka. I think that's how you spell it. Nope. I was missing the accent. Alrighty. Right. So this artwork was created by the culture. All right. B. Using specific visual evidence justify the attribution by describing relevant similarities in both the form and content between the work shown and another work of the same type created by the same culture. Right? So we could talk about this artwork being similar in form in that it has a bird on the outside, and then when you open it up, it has a like a human face on the inside, right? So bird face on outside opens up to human face on inside, right? Does anybody remember the specific name of the visual style that was used by the Quack Waka Waka group? Formline style, excellent. Yes. Yes, so we also have the use of the formline style. And that is going to utilize primarily wood with red, white, and black paint, right? And these kind of like rounded organic shapes. You see it in a lot of different cultures, like indigenous American cultures along the Pacific Northwest in particular. Where did y'all learn this? From my videos. My goodness. All right. So, using specific contextual evidence, explain the function of this type of work. So, does anybody remember the specific name of the ceremony that was used, or in which these masks were used? If we don't specifically say that the style is form line, if we describe the characteristics, would we still get the point? Yes. If you don't remember form line style, don't worry about it. Yes, potlatch ceremony. So I like to describe the potlatch ceremony basically as the Kwakiutl culture's version of like Oprah's favorite. You have this these extremely wealthy people within the community that are hosting this big party, right? And during that party, they are hosting this enormous feast, right? And then there are these dances, right? And there are dancers wearing masks, right? And the two halves of the mask are closed. And then you'll notice that there's these little strings that are attached to either side of the mask. And the dancer will pull on the strings and then open up the mask to reveal the human face inside. Okay? So during these ceremonies, the wealthy members of this particular culture would like basically pay for everybody's food and then also give their stuff away. Right? So, using specific contextual evidence, explain the function of this type of work. It was worn in a potlatch ceremony. Potlatch ceremony with a costume. And the halves of the mask would be opened by the dancer. Dancer. Okay, I saw a unknown for the artist counted as identifier. So B, I saw something that another student mentioned in the chat here. In terms of between the work shown and the other work of the same type created by the same culture. So similarly to the transformation mask in the curriculum, curriculum, this mask has a bird face on the outside and opens up to a human face on the inside. It also uses the form line style. There. Alrighty. Ugh. And then using specific visual or contextual evidence, explain how the function shaped either the form or the content of this type of artwork. So can anybody remember exactly why these avian forms, these bird forms, as well as these human forms were used in transformation masks? Yes. So a really important thing to remember for a lot of cultures around the world is this association with shamanism, right? And animistic religions, right? So in animistic religions, there is this belief, generally speaking, that the natural world is inhabited by spirits, right? And that elements of the natural world are imbued with the spiritual power. So we see this with the concept of mana, for example, in many parts of the Pacific Islands, particularly in Polynesia, right? Now, this particular animism manifests as specific deities that are associated with families within the Kwakiutl culture, right? So there is, for example, a raven deity, and that raven deity has the ability to kind of transform between a human and a bird, right? What's also interesting too is that with a lot of these masks, you'll notice that the human part of the face isn't like entirely human. It has this very beak-like nose, right? Yeah, you could also potentially mention the thunderbird, right? So the bird is meant to represent a thunderbird, eagle, or raven, all of which are significant in Kwakiutl culture because of their connections to the spiritual realm and family ancestry, right? Whoops, it's getting too big. The function shaped either the form or the content of this work. Yeah, so we have the representation of the bird in this mask was meant to draw a connection to these culturally significant narratives that were expressed through dance. Alrighty. Would they really ask a work as obscure as this? This was a question on the 2022 exam, so they very well could. Okay. Alrighty. Can you use the same piece of visual characteristic, like the human face, inside of the bird for both part B and part D? Yes, you could. How important is spelling on this work? Again, it's not super important. As long as it somewhat resembles whatever the name of the artwork is, you're fine. Okay. Can I write everything and hope they don't take points off? That's not a very good use of your time, to be honest. And honestly, if you contradict yourself too, like the AP reader can't really give you points. How do I know the range of dates acceptable for identifying artworks? Honestly, I tell my students not to really worry about dates, and they tend to do pretty well. I find dates to be more of a distraction and a hindrance than something that is particularly helpful unless you are really a numbers person. Typically, when it asks for attribution information, like, or identifiers, I typically go with the name of the artist or the culture of origin, the designation, and the materials. Those are typically my go-tos. I don't remember the dates. I've been teaching this class for 8 years and I don't remember the dates. You'll be fine. Alrighty. So this is a question that I made up. Okay. So this artwork is from Unit 4, which is later Europe and the colonial Americas. It looks like a lot of you have already identified that this artwork is, yes, by Jean-Honoré Fragonard. Jean-Honoré Fragonard, right? Who created the infamous swing, right? Love that painting. All right. So justify your attribution by providing at least 2 visual similarities between the form and content of this work and another work created by the same artist, right? So we have the elements of nature, right? So in Fragonard's work, The Swing, we have this what's called a bucolic or an Arcadian setting. It's like very lush. It looks like it's right at the peak of spring. There's all of these blooms and flowers. Everything looks like super, super nice, right? So we could put depiction of trees, flowers in bloom, bucolic Arcadian setting, right? What else? Bright pastel colors, yes. So we could talk about the use of color. So for this piece, similarly to the swing, we do have some contrast, right? So it's creating a little bit of drama, a little bit of intrigue, and it's also really drawing our eye to where this woman's hand is here in the middle, and like our eye is really going to her. It's a spotlight, right? And then we could also just say pastel colors. Yes, there's also cherub statues. So who do we think that this figure in the center is here? So the smaller figure to the left over here is Cupid, and who is Cupid's mom? Aphrodite. Excellent. And typically, Aphrodite is associated with what? Love, right? Love and beauty, right? Right. So explain how the content of this work informs the audience of the work's possible narrative. This is as to what's going on here. Playful aristocracy, promiscuity, infidelity, cheating. Yeah, so we could probably like make a pretty good assumption going to have to do with aristocracy, right? We have these figures or these figures that are aristocratic, right? They have these fancy clothes. They're in a fancy garden, right? There's also potentially this narrative that these figures are in love or that there's some sort of like amorous thing going on between them, right? Right. Yeah, and they're also kind of like looking out, right? So maybe they're like a little bit like cautious and being like, "Oh, we can't be caught here," right? Cautious. I cannot spell today. So maybe they're doing this in secret, right? Alrighty. Yeah, so this painting is actually from a series of four works by Fragonard, and it's basically a cycle of paintings that's actually very similar to the Marriage à la Mode by um, Hogarth. Is it Hogarth? Yeah, it's by William Hogarth, right? And it talks about this like very typical, like almost stereotypical like engagement between these two figures, and then lo and behold, they're already cheating on each other not long after the marriage, right? So it's a similar sort of cycle with this piece, right? Yeah, we love William Hogarth and the tete-a-tete. Alrighty. Do you get credit for the identifier if you only know the artist's last name? Yes. Yeah, you don't need to know their first name. Excellent. All right. Now we're going to be moving on to an. So, can we identify the region and or belief system that produced this artwork based on its similarities to another work in the AP course content? Donatello. Not quite. Yes. Yes, so this artwork is actually very similar to Shiva as Lord of Dance, right? And that artwork was created by somebody who believed in Hinduism, right? So we're going to say Hinduism and India, right? So we have this similarity to Shiva as Lord of Dance. I love that piece. I'm waiting for it to appear on an exam one day because I really like it. Alrighty. So Jeff Koons. Oh my goodness, I'd love to see that comparison and contrast essay. Alrighty. So justify the attribution by providing at least two visual similarities between form and content of this work and another work produced in that same region and or for that same belief system. So how is this artwork similar to Shiva as Lord of Dance or another work of Hindu art? Same material, yes. So we could say that it's a similar material, which is cast, I want to say bronze. I don't remember. Does anybody remember the process that is used for casting metal? Anybody? Lost wax process. Excellent. Right. We also have you could also mention in terms of like a similarity, you could talk about the figures on the facade of Lakshmana Temple, right? So what are some similarities between this figure and Shiva as Lord of Dance or the figures on the facade of Lakshmana Temple? Yes, that 3-point contrapposto, right? Curved figure or the dance pose. So it almost kind of looks like they're swaying. Right? And there's like this sense of motion to it, right? And then they're on some sort of platform, right? And there's like a little hole in it. Right? Works like this supposed to be experienced in their original context. So remember that Hinduism is a very icon central religion, right? So there's lots and lots of gods and deities, and oftentimes temples are going to be devoted to one of these deities. So, for example, like when you go inside of Lakshmana Temple and you get to the womb chamber, also known as the shrine room or the Garbhagriha, you come across a cult statue, essentially, like a statue of the god who is housed essentially in the temple. Right. And usually there is a priest there that is going to facilitate an offering or a prayer for you. So each temple is going to be devoted to one of these little gods. Right. So housed in a Hindu temple. And then it's also important to remember that these statues, as we see them in museums, are very different from how they're presented in their original context. Oftentimes, they would be covered in cloth or have flowers or pigments applied to them or some sort of offerings. Because remember, like in Hinduism, these sculptures are thought to be something that is like a manifestation of the god itself. So they're considered really important. So you're going to give them offerings. You're going to festoon them with various things, right? So may have been covered in fabrics, pigments, flowers, given offerings. And then another thing too in Hinduism is that there's a lot of holidays, and oftentimes on like special holidays, these statues would be taken outside of these temples and paraded around in public. Right? So again, these are just two questions that I made up. They're not necessarily completely like congruent to what you would expect to see on the AP exam, but I just wanted to give us a little bit more practice with this attribution because I know that this is something that students struggle with. Okay. Alrighty, I'm going to be moving on from attribution now, and I'm going to be moving on to the next subject here. Okay, so this is something that a lot of students have questions about. This is architecture. And I have a slides presentation that you can find by clicking the link on this presentation right here. And it goes over some important architecture terms curriculum. Okay. I would say that out of the entire like vocabulary for the AP curriculum, these terms are the ones that you absolutely need to know. These are the terms that are going to come up the most frequently in terms of just being present in lots of different artworks. It's really important as well to know the different parts of a church and the different parts of a mosque. Okay. I would say that another form of architecture that you should focus on especially carefully is Greek architecture. This is because Greek architecture makes a comeback many, many, many times throughout art history, right? So being able to label the pediment, the frieze, the architrave, the column, and the stylobate are going to be pretty important. There's actually a lot more terms than this that are associated with Greek architecture. I have simplified it down to just a handful to make things relatively easier. Okay. As a reminder, the pediment is this isosceles triangle that sits at the very top. The frieze is this band that is beneath the pediment. And sometimes the frieze will have a relief sculpture on it. The architrave is basically like this lintel beneath the frieze. And then we have the columns, right? And remember that there is the capital of the column, the shaft, and the base, right? So the three orders of columns that you'll see over and over again in art history are Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Okay. So make sure that you're able to distinguish between those. You should also remember terms like post and lintel, ground plan, hypostyle hall, ashlar masonry, corbelled arch. Y'all can read this. Okay. Now, if I were to boil down AP art history architecture movements to maybe around 10 that you should absolutely remember, I would say remember these 10 that are coming up in the slides. Okay. So, and I put them like more or less in chronological order. I mean, not really, but sort of. So, ancient Greek, right? This is really, really important because it would go on to influence many other movements in art history, including the Romans. We see it in Baroque and neoclassical. Like it's everywhere, right? So, being able to identify something as being influenced by Greek architecture is going to be super important. Okay. Ancient Roman is also important because the ancient Romans would go on to influence lots of other places as well. The ancient Roman architecture, by and large, is very similar to Greek architecture in terms of its aesthetics, but we have a couple of things that are being added into the mix with Roman art that we don't see in Greek art. You will not, for example, see a keystone arch in Greek architecture. Right? Arches were something that were really perfected by the Romans. And when you take an arch and you multiply it to make a tunnel, you have a barrel vault. And if you take two barrel vaults and you intersect them together, you get a groin vault, right? If you take an arch and you spin it on its axis, 360 degrees, you get a dome or a cupola, as we see here in the Pantheon, right? The Romans also perfected or they invented concrete, which was this material that really facilitated fast building. Whereas in the past, you would have to have all of these like marble or stone blocks that you're individually carving and dragging and stacking, and it's a total pain, right? With concrete, you just mix up your slurry and you pour it, right? This is how the Colosseum was built in 8 years. It's pretty remarkable. That and lots and lots and lots of slave labor, right? Ancient Egyptian architecture is also important. We're also like, of course, very familiar with like the ancient Egyptian pyramids in Giza, in Lower Egypt, from the Old Kingdom. But it's also important to remember this like hypostyle style architecture that we see in places like the Temple of Amun-Ra and Hypostyle Hall, as well as the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. Right? There's lots of mortuary monuments in ancient Egyptian art. I would also say that of all of the Indigenous American curriculum, that Incan masonry is going to be the most distinctive and perhaps the most iconic. We see their use of ashlar masonry. So, ashlar masonry is a technique where you are cutting the stones to fit exactly into one another. There is no glue, there is no mortar, no nothing that is keeping these stones together other than the fact that they are carved to fit into each other and their own gravity. And this is one of the reasons they have stood so perfectly for hundreds and hundreds of years, despite this being a seismically active region. There's lots of earthquakes here, right? So these stones are super heavy. Some of them weigh several dozen tons a piece, and that gravity and those perfect shapes, like Legos, are allowing them to stay together. I love ashlar masonry. It's super underrated. I would also say that Gothic architecture is pretty distinctive and different. Gothic architecture is going to be very vertically oriented, and this is interesting because when you're in a church, when you're in a Gothic church, you're meant to look up, right, towards heaven, towards God. A lot of times Gothic churches tend to have very dark interiors because their windows are towards the top because the walls are so thick. But we do have these beautiful colored lights coming in through rose windows, as well as stained glass. So our kind of quintessential Gothic cathedral is Chartres Cathedral, right, which had the Lady of the Beautiful Window piece. So there's lots of elements of these structures that really emphasize height, including things like spires. And oftentimes, spires are going to be connected to the main body of the structure through buttresses. So these kind of like diagonal lines that are coming off of the main body, those are flying buttresses, right? Is Stonehenge Gothic? No. All right. So another important movement to remember that goes on to influence a lot of contemporary architecture is the international style. So this is the style that was used in the Seagram building, the one that looks like the giant like monolith from the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey, as well as the Villa Savoy. I like to call them the baby octopus and the giant squid because they have these little like leggy columns supporting a main body. They are meant to be this very IKEA furniture-esque sort of structure where it's meant to be one size fits all. They're not very personal. They're not very like sentimental. And they tend to be very monochromatic in terms of their presentation. Lots of black, white, and gray, lots of geometric shapes and forms, right? Interestingly, there's a lot of architects that reacted rather negatively to the international style, and they did so through what is called postmodernism. So, an example of postmodernism is the house in Newcastle County. That is one of the universally hated artworks by most of my students. Romanesque versus Gothic. Romanesque tends to be relatively shorter and less decorated, and Gothic is like the most ostentatiously decorated, and it's very tall and very thin. What is the house in Newcastle County? I have a video on that. This chat reeks of teenage boy, and I wouldn't have it any other way. That's teaching high school for you. Alrighty. I would also say that Southeast Asian Buddhist architecture is going to be another very distinctive style that we see in, for example, Angkor Wat in the city of Angkor Thom, in Borobudur, right? So one of the main structures that we see in architecture in this region is the stupa, right? The the heap. That's what's stupa is Sanskrit for heat. Heat. Sorry, losing my voice here. And we see the stupa basically as the sepulchral mound. It represents the Buddha's body and the Buddha's ashes. And there's lots and lots of different structures that are kind of like tall and pointy that are meant to be stupas. And then as we move, as Buddhism moves through East Asia, the stupa eventually evolves into the pagoda, which looks like this, right? So, in a lot of Buddhist architecture, you will see radial symmetry. So, radial symmetry is where you have that sort of like pizza slice and you're repeating it along a central axis all the way around. There's lots of references to mandalas and Buddhist cosmology with Mount Meru at the center. Right. This is why a lot of these monuments have tiers or levels. Borobudur is a great example of this. And then we also have this notion of like a microcosm. It's meant to be a miniature representation of the universe. Microcosms are actually pretty common throughout world cultures. Excuse me, when it comes to architecture. For example, there's a microcosm at Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, in the Inca civilization. They had like a little diorama with little like metal corn and metal llamas and so on that were meant to represent like the entirety of the Inca Empire and existence as they knew it, right? We're making connections. Yes, the metal llamas. Alrighty. So, in terms of some other artist movements to be aware of, Baroque is definitely one that will probably come up on your exam at least. Baroque artwork tends to be very Greco-Roman in terms of its foundations, but kind of lets them melt out in the sun for a little while. There's a lot of, for example, pediments that are super wavy, or columns that are really like fluffy and fruity. Like it's very curvy. It's very camp, right? And it's very decorative, very dramatic, and there's a lot of gilding. And in cases where people can't necessarily get marble to sculpt their facades, they use stucco instead, which is basically like a sort of plaster that you can mold into shapes and it dries white, so it kind of looks like marble. So, for example, right here in the Cornaro Chapel, we have stucco that is being used to create this sort of curved pediment motif over the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. You see a lot of decorative elements in Baroque architecture as well. Lots of statues, lots of gilding, lots of glitzy gold stuff, as well as you can see and hear like these decorative pieces of marble that are creating this kind of polychromatic effect here. occupy space, but they're a lot less stiff than what you would expect to see in high Renaissance artwork. It's a lot more dramatic. There's a lot more movement. There's a lot more of like a sense of capturing a specific moment in time rather than like fake candid School of Athens, right? In terms of understanding the differences between Northern Baroque and Southern Baroque, I would understand why they would be different. So remember that the Baroque era is coming around the time of the Counter Reformation, right? I like to describe the Counter Reformation as the Catholic Church strikes back, right? So you might remember that during the Reformation, put very simply, Martin Luther had a beef with the Catholic Church, right? And he went on to found Lutheranism, right? And he was basically saying, like, Catholic Church, you're being super hypocritical. Like, you're like getting people like get out of hell free cards if they pay enough money to you. Like, church is less about like the ideas of the Bible and more about like this glitzy glamness, and I don't like that. So, and again, I'm oversimplifying here. I'm not a religion expert. So when we go to the north, we tend to see artwork that's a lot more understated. And a lot of the religious imagery and symbols that we see in Northern European art during the Renaissance and the Baroque period is very covert. This is why we see a lot of like weird symbolism, like, oh, there's 3 flowers in that vase. That those 3 flowers are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? Whereas in Baroque art, it's like Jesus, right? It's like it's super obvious, right? All right. So next is East Asia, particularly China, Korea, and Japan. Pagodas and courtyard style architecture in East Asian architecture. There's a great example of courtyard style architecture depicted in Night Attack at Sanjot Palace, that Imaki narrative scroll. Another great example of a continuous narrative, by the way. And then, of course, we have the courtyard style depicted in the Forbidden City. There's a lot of fantastic like wood bracketing construction methods that aren't really explained explicitly in the curriculum except for the Nio Guardian figures. Basically, these pieces of wood are carved almost like Legos to fit together in this way that seems very seamless, and it's used in both statuary and architecture. Okay? Alrighty. And then last, or not, actually, yes, last but certainly not least, we have Islamic architecture. It is aniconic. We are not going to see images of people, not going to see images of animals, because these are considered idols, and idols are forbidden in Islam, in most sects of Islam, right? Now, this is important to remember. For a lot of artworks from the Islamic world that have a secular purpose, we see people and animals all the time, right? For example, like the Pyxis of Al-Mukhira. We have people on there, we have animals on there, right? If we're looking at a mosque, for example, or a monument like the Dome of the Rock, we're not going to see images of people. We're not going to see images of animals. What we're going to see instead are lots of calligraphy. Calligraphy is considered the highest form of art in Islam because it is communicating the literal word of Allah or God, right? We also see a lot of symmetry in Islam, and this symmetry is related to this Islamic idea of paradise, which is this garden with a lot of these very well organized canals, and there's certain species of plants that live there. A great example of like paradise manifesting as a work of architecture is the Taj Mahal, for example, right? I think there was an essay question on that a couple of years ago. There's also a lot of pointed arches as well as elements of mosque architecture, even in places that aren't mosques. So, for example, you will see minarets on the Taj Mahal, right? It's not a mosque, it's a tomb, it's a mausoleum, but it has these minaret like structures, right? So, were there any kind of like other overarching architecture in general? My favorite artwork is the Ambum Stone. Is that valid? I would say yes, it is very valid. I teach in Orange County, and I'm pretty close to UC Irvine, and their mascot is the anteater. So we get a lot of people associated with UCI. They get very excited with the Ambum Stone. Alrighty. Church plans. Huh. Like, what do you mean by church plans? Like, how to identify like what's the narthex versus the apse, or being able to distinguish them from each other. What's the difference between axial, basilican, cruciform, and other church plans? So axial is a word that is used to describe basically anything with axial symmetry. When I talk about axial and radial symmetry with my students, I talk about kind of like chordates, like animals with backbone symmetry. It is the same on one side as it is on the other, a human being. So, if something has radial symmetry, that means that there's like a pizza slice that you're repeating around a central axis, like a starfish, right? So, typically, something doesn't have like perfect axial symmetry or perfect radial symmetry. But if you could basically fold a plan in half and one side would be mirrored on the other, that is an example of an axial plan. If you could take that pizza slice and repeat it around a central axis, that would be an example of a central plan. Okay. Now, cruciform churches, cruciform is a word that means cross shaped. So a cruciform church is going to have axial symmetry. An example of a centrally planned church would probably be like the Basilica of San Vitale. Alrighty. This chat is wild. My goodness. Alrighty. So, next, I had a question about studying for the multiple choice questions. I actually created a slides presentation and a video recently to talk about the different kinds of multiple choice questions associated with artworks on the AP exam. This presentation also talks about creating your own multiple choice questions as a method of studying artworks with which you are less familiar. Um, this is actually a really good activity to do with your friends or with people that are in your same AP Art History class. For those of you who are listening to the stream today and are educators, I highly recommend doing this activity with students. Shout out to all of you, by the way, for joining us on the stream. I know that you're busy and stressed out as much as the students are. Thank you for being here. But the other thing too is that the College Board doesn't really release practice MCQs, which is kind of annoying. So you kind of have to make them up yourself. I also created a practice MCQ that is mostly focused on units 2, 3, and 4 that you can take right here. It's a Google form and it's 80 questions. It's just a little practice test. Alrighty. Alrighty. Is the practice MCQ that you created easier or harder than the one in the exam? I would say it's about the same. And for students too who are concerned about your scores on practice MCQs, it is very common, for example, for a student to get like a 40 or a 50 out of 80 on the MCQ and then do pretty well on the essays and still be able to get a 4 or a 5. The thing to remember with AP exams is that like scoring, like having like 90% accuracy in your responses is not necessarily going to be a 5, and 80 to 90% is going to be a 4, like, and so on and so forth. That's not necessarily the way that AP works. I would say that probably like maybe 5% of students who take this exam score 90% accuracy or above, if that. I've never been a part of the grading process for the College Board, but a lot of the students that I've had in my class that routinely get like 75%, 80% on the multiple choice and do really well in their essay questions will get a 5 on the exam. So I wouldn't necessarily look at it as like, oh, like I got like a 50 out of 80. I'm not going to like get a passing grade. That's not the way that it works. Okay. On the practice FRQs, I had questions I wasn't able to answer at all. If that were to happen on the exam tomorrow, how do I respond? Or is my best option to just not respond at all? I would focus on the questions that you can answer. Get those answered first. Make sure that you're clearly labeling them, and then go back to those other questions and try to rely on what else you know about the curriculum. If there's anything about the artwork that is like, oh yeah, that looks kind of similar to something else, like start there and try to make that connection. But I would prioritize the works that you know first, and not necessarily like hum and haw over like, I don't remember this at all. Chances are you remember something. And I would also just read through what the questions are asking, because oftentimes the ways that the essay questions are structured is going to give you a hint as to what to write about. Okay. Okay. Oh boy. So of course I got a question that was like, can you talk about all 6 of the FRQs? And I was like, probably not in as much detail as you would want me to. If you wants to look at Google Slides presentations that I have made about each of the 6 essay questions and how to answer them using a specific example that was provided by the College Board, I have links that are provided in this Google Slides presentation that will take you there. I also have a couple of videos on the AP Art History channel that talks about these kinds of essays in a little bit more depth. Okay? Please notice me, I love you. I have noticed you. Thank you for the love. All right. So I'm not going to necessarily talk about like each particular essay type in depth during this live stream. But what I am going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the major skills that you should hone essentially to do well on essay questions as a whole. Okay. So in summary, between all 6 of the essay questions, you should definitely know how to conduct a visual analysis. You should always be able to conduct a visual analysis on a work of art, even if you've never seen it before. This is because visual analysis is basically describing what the artwork looks like and, whenever possible, using art history vocabulary to describe it, right? And again, you can do this without having ever seen a work of art before. Like, they're going to give you a work of art that you've never seen before on the exam in an attribution question, right? So being able to be like, oh yes, the color used is this. This is a 3-dimensional artwork. It looks like it's subtractive sculpture. Like, being able to describe what you are seeing is a visual analysis. Okay? You also should be able to conduct a contextual analysis. This is a skill that a lot of students struggle with, especially because context leads back to history, and this is not necessarily something that you can glean just by looking at an artwork, right? This is why I talk about historical topics in my slides, typically before I get into the nitty-gritty of each artwork. Okay? So when it comes to contextual analysis, you need to think about the broader context in which an artwork was made. Who commissioned it? Why was it made? Who is being depicted in it, if there are any figures in there? Like, what materials are being used and why are those materials significant, right? What are the circumstances under which this artwork was made? Think about those things. You also need to be able to connect artworks to tradition, style, and practice. And this applies to artworks that are in the curriculum. And on occasion, it will also require you to make connections to tradition, style, and practice for artworks that are not in the AP curriculum. So, for example, a couple of years ago, there is a connection, style, and practice question that was linked to this piece right here, which is called The Conversion of St. Paul, and it's by Caravaggio, a Baroque artist, right? So this piece was not explicitly in the AP curriculum, but we did have a Caravaggio piece that was the Calling of St. Matthew, right? So being able to connect this piece back to the Calling of St. Matthew in terms of visual similarities is going to be able to facilitate that connection to practice. What are the other ones? Style and tradition. Okay. Also, you should be able to identify similarities and differences between works of art. We're going to be doing a little bit of that today in a little drill that I have. And similarities and differences is something that is linked to visual analysis. I would say that comparative art history is a really good way to study the artworks. If you look at two artworks, for example, that have a similar theme and you're able to distinguish how they're different from each other, you're able to figure out basically what makes them unique, right? So you're going to see a little bit more of what I mean by this when we get into the practice questions. Also, describing the reasons and circumstances behind decisions made by artists is going to be important as well. So, for example, saying, okay, this artist is using, like, let's use, for example, self-portrait as a soldier, right? Ernst Kirchner. I'm surprised nobody's mentioned that in the chat yet. That's one of the student favorites, right? So, self-portrait as a soldier uses these really violently bright colors, right? So the reason that Kirchner is choosing those colors is to create a sense of anxiety, right? And then also he's like depicting himself as a sort of like yellowish green hue to make him look sickly because he's not in a good place while he's painting that piece, right? Yes, I drove a truck in the war and now I'm scarred and emo. Yeah, basically. He went through some stuff. World War One was a really rough time for a lot of people. All right. So again, if you want to click on these links and access resources on how to answer these specific kinds of questions, please feel free to do so. Okay. All right. And this right here is an explanation from the College Board about what each of these questions specifically is. I'm not going to read this for you. You can all read this yourselves. All right. So what we're going to be doing now is practice some of the skills that you might be asked to demonstrate on the FRQ. So for this example right here, we have Pink Panther and Lying with the Wolf, right? So in the chat over here, what are at least two similarities between these artworks in terms of visual things, like visual similarities? And what are two differences? Yes, woman hugging an animal, right? So we have this like physical contact, this embrace or hug between a woman and an animal. And then we also have nudity, right? What else? Alrighty. Yeah, so these are typically the similarities that my students identify. This physical contact between a woman and an animal, and the fact that the female presenting characters are in the nude, right? So in terms of differences, medium or media was mentioned. So for example, Pink Panther is made out of porcelain. It's glazed. Whereas Kiki Smith's Lying with the Wolf is a drawing. Right? Yes, there's also differences in terms of color, right? You could describe Pink Panther as being polychrome. Polychrome is a fancy word meaning multicolored. Poly meaning many and chrome meaning color. So you can say multicolored or polychrome. They'll know what you're talking about on the exam. Versus having just black and white, monochromatic, right? What is made Marcelo? Hey! Thought I recognized that name. All right. All right. Yeah, they also have differences in terms of their facial expressions, right? So the Jane Mansfield character over here in Pink Panther has this sort of like fake smile, right? Versus this kind of like more neutral expression. Yeah, so it looks like a lot of you in the comments are already getting into like some contextual differences between this piece, right? Ooh, isn't the idea of Pink Panther to compare the woman and the panther as objects? Honestly, Jeff Koons could be anything, right? Yeah, so one of the things that is one of the major themes that is discussed in Pink Panther by Jeff Koons is banality, right? This idea that something is so commonplace that it becomes like uninteresting or boring. So a lot of Jeff Koons' artwork deliberately uses this imagery that people are very familiar with, at least at the time that this piece is being created, and it's elevating this kitsch, these knickknacks, to this enormous scale. And when you actually see this piece in person is actually a couple feet high. It's kind of disturbing, right? So it's creating this sense of like, ugh, like we have that visceral reaction to it, very similar to the reaction that we might have to Mara Oppenheim's Object, the fur covered cup, saucer, and spoon, right? That kind of like, ugh, that's cringe. Like I don't like that, right? And we also have Jane Mansfield here presented as this like almost unrealistically proportioned character. And she's like clearly topless. You can see like the very top of her butt crack, right? It's meant to be something that is provocative and not very tasteful, right? Whereas Lying with the Wolf over here, we have a lot of connections to mythology in this piece. And I want you to think about too, like in mythology, typically relationships between women and wolves are that of prey and predator. Right? Like in Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf preys on Little Red Riding Hood and she needs to be like saved by a man, right? Whereas when we look at this piece right here, we are seeing this peaceful coexistence between the two figures, right? You'll also notice that the figure is positioned kind of awkwardly and stiffly. It's a reclining female nude, but it's not Venus of Urbino, right? But she's got her toes out. There, it's not super flattering, right? It's not presenting like the quote unquote like idealized like woman that we are expect to see in a reclining female nude in art history, right? So whereas Pink Panther is presenting this kind of like almost exaggerated, like male gazy ideal. In Lying with the Wolf, we have this very frank and kind of subversive depiction of the female form. It's like contradicting our expectations in terms of relationships between like women and animals, as well as this idea of like women's bodies supposing to be like projected as these very like appealing things. Alrighty. So let's move on to our next one. So this piece right here is trade or gifts for trading land with white people. Does anybody want to start us off with at least 3 visual elements of this artwork? Yes, it's collage, right? Collage is a word that means that we have a lot of these different elements that have been kind of like cut up into pieces and then we're reassembling them and reorienting them in a new way, right? The word collage is actually derived from the word for glue. Oh, we had the red brushstrokes cut are meant to emulate blood. And then we also have, yeah, it's a triptych. Triptych is a fancy word that means an artwork presented in 3 panels. In 3 panels. It's difficult to see the canvas the canvases. They're each square canvases, and you can kind of see the partitions very faintly in this image. Yeah, we also have the sports paraphernalia. There we go. Right. Yes, and then we also have this boat in the center, right? This kind of boat is a canoe. Excellent. Can you provide as many visual elements as you see and they just don't count the ones that don't apply? Honestly, for a visual analysis, you should be able to identify at least 3 things that you can definitively see accurately. I guess. I don't know. I'm having expert blind spot at this point, right? Alrighty. So we discussed a couple of different visual elements of this work, right? And what is like specific about the sports paraphernalia? Anybody? Yes, yes. So a lot of the sports paraphernalia features this imagery that basically commodifies Native Americans, right? So we have all these sports mascots that are like the Braves, right? There are these names that refer to these groups in these nowadays kind of like very derogatory ways, right? So sports teams with Native American, I would call them like caricature mascots, right? Car caricature My goodness, caricature mascots, right? So, in terms of why Jean Quick de C. Smith created this artwork, yes, this was part of the quincentenary non-celebration, right? 500 years since Christopher Columbus sailed to the Americas, right? So 500 years since Columbus, and this was being branded as like a quincentenary celebration by many people in the Americas. But John Quick de C. Smith was like, this is a non-celebration, right? Ooh, A Push helped you with this artwork. Excellent. Yeah, and then we also have like this imagery that is talking about what has happened to indigenous Americas since 1492, right? So this piece is talking about like how Native Americans have been commodified into these caricatures. They've been homogenized into these groups that are not at all reflective of the diversity of different indigenous American groups that continue to exist in North America to this day, right? There's also many references when you look at the specific collage elements, as well as some of the objects that are hanging from this chain right here, to a lot of the consequences of colonialism on these groups, including alcoholism. We have a couple of alcohol bottles. And there's also just like this notion of like this mass disenfranchisement that's happening as people are moved off of their land and onto these crammed reservations that are not at all similar to the lands that they and their ancestors lived on for thousands of years, right? So this is a piece that's about displacement. It's about these 500 years of violence. I would actually compare this piece to Kara Walker's piece, D-Town Rebellion. Yeah, the canoe also being out of water is meant to reflect this sense of displacement. This thing that was built for a specific purpose can no longer realize that purpose because it's not in the water, right? Franchisement of Native American groups. My goodness. Alrighty. Canoe out of water equals loss of function and agency, right? Yeah, and you can remember the date as 1992 because it's 500 years since 1492. Excellent. Alrighty. So here's another one. This was another essay question that appeared a few years ago. What are a couple of visual characteristics of this artwork that we could discuss? Yes, tenebrism. We love tenebrism in this house, right? So tenebrism is this use of extremely dark background to the point where we can't really see anything, and there's usually like one light source that is illuminating the scene, right? So very high contrast. I like to call it chiaroscuro triple base boosted, right? Dark, almost black background with single light source. Yeah, and tenebrism oftentimes is very dramatic, right? So it's creating a sense of drama, right? Yes, we are also capturing a specific moment in time. We have this man who has fallen on the ground. And what seems to us have happened to this guy? He fell off the horse. Yes. Yeah, and where is the light hitting? It's hitting on his body, right? So this particular narrative is not something that is covered in the AP curriculum, but essentially, if I remember correctly from the story, there's a guy named Saul, and then he falls off of his horse because he receives this revelation from God, and then he changes his name to Paul. Yes, we have this man who's fallen on the ground. The light is shining on the man. And then the man has his arms up, right? Yeah, look at how dramatically those arms are placed, right? They're creating these diagonals that are radiating from like his head, right? And then we also have his fingers coming right up against the edge of the canvas right here. This is called a tangent, right? Whenever you have something coming right up against the edge of a canvas like this, there's a lot of tangents, for example, in Self-Portrait as a Soldier, right? This is creating tension, right? So in terms of creating a sense of drama, we could refer to the use of diagonal lines. Good. Like triangular compositions are also really popular in, for example, like Romanticism and Baroque art. And we also have tenebrism, right? Tenebrism, like high contrast. Tenebrism equals high contrast. And what this is also doing too is that it's really bringing the figures that are in the foreground closer to us, right? There's also like capturing this moment in time. which is very, very common in Baroque art, right? So for questions like this, would tenebralism work for part A and part B? Yes, but you'd have to basically describe like how is this contrast creating a sense of drama? Right? Yeah, you could talk about like the gesture or the expression of the figures as well. So here's the next portion right here. Using specific evidence, explain how this work demonstrates change from the artistic traditions of the Renaissance. So what were some qualities of artworks from the Renaissance? See a couple of things. Yeah. Yeah, a couple of these things really work. So typically with like high Renaissance, you can expect to see a couple of things. Typically, we have a very clear horizon and or vanishing point, right? And usually that vanishing point is in the center. Usually things like Last Supper or the School of Athens. Typically compositions in the high Renaissance are going to be very symmetrical as well. Like what is on one side is going to be on the other. They're also very orderly and organized, and they're also like very bright and colorful, right? Like there's a lot of vivid color. In this piece, the mood is a lot darker. You're not seeing like the vividness, for example, of the School of Athens. You're not seeing the linear perspective with the horizon line and the vanishing point, right? What we're seeing instead is this dark background that is bringing these figures forward. We're seeing an asymmetrical composition, right? And instead of capturing this kind of like highly idealized, like candid, like, oh, the philosophers are all kind of like walking in a line, like they're photographing a wedding, right? We have this like, this guy has fallen off of his horse. Like Caravaggio was very much a person who reveled in like the humanity of the figures that he painted, oftentimes to the point of like really irking the church. So what he's doing here is that he's bringing these subjects back to earth. He's making them less these pie in the sky ideals, these figures that are adorning the walls of like the Vatican, and more of these characters that are personal, that these scenes that are intimate, that feel like they could be us. Right. And this is one of the reasons why Caravaggio's artworks are so engaging and why he tends to be a favorite of students. They can see things that they recognize in them. Right. So you could talk about like the Renaissance equals bright and colorful versus this piece is dark and moody, uses tenebrism rather than chiaroscuro, right? Chiaroscuro, there we go. And you could also talk about like the humanness of the figures, right? Renaissance has very orderly, stable, like almost manicured scenes versus the like asymmetrical, stark, and human depiction of figures here. All right. All right. So this is a last question. So this is a comparison that might be a little bit unusual or unconventional, we'll say. So Our piece on the left is the Terracotta Army of Qin Shi Huang. And then the piece on the right is Sunflower Seeds by Ai Weiwei. So, what are some similarities between these pieces? Yes, they're both ceramic, right? Yeah, in the case of the Terracotta Army, we have terracotta. And then in Sunflower Seeds, we have those are made out of porcelain. It's a higher